Bye, brother.
Okay, let's get rolling. Welcome back. Hope your week is going okay. Had a fun Halloween with a bunch of trick-or-treaters, a lot of kids in some fun costumes, and then a group of teenagers who didn't say anything, but like held up their bags to me. And it was like, I was like, is this ransom? You know, like, what's going on here? You know, I'm fine with teenagers and older people doing trick-or-treating. It's whatever, but like, say trick-or-treat. So hope you had a fun Halloween and enjoyed this weird sleep stuff that we have. So, you know, most of you have been here for a little bit, but I do recommend continuing to check things like ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation. If you're planning to travel, since they'll update you about road conditions, and it can be kind of dicey if you're new to the area and not familiar with getting around and some of the more treacherous stuff. Okay, so how many folks here are seniors? Yeah, so we've got a couple seniors. If you're a senior, the deadline to apply for graduation is this Friday. So you can complete that application online. I just wanted to put that on your radar so that you're on track. Also, because you're a senior, right, you can register early for the remaining courses that you need. So November 4th, which is this Friday, is also the winter registration opening for seniors. So I definitely recommend chatting with your advisor to get those final courses that you need all lined up. For everybody else, first year, sophomore, junior, registration for winter 2023 starts next Monday on November 7th. If you are really into it and have some really in-demand classes, it starts at 6 a.m. If you haven't already, I recommend talking with your advisor about courses to take in winter 23 to help you just to make sure that you're on track with what you need to do. Some of the courses that I'm teaching in the winter are small group communication, along with public speaking, and then I'm teaching an interviewing course that got moved over to the spring. So I believe it's 2 sections of small group and one of public speaking. So teaching a few of those, and then health and science online in the spring. So definitely start to look into those and be thinking about what you would like to do as you're going forward with your classes. So we spent some time on Monday talking about the social movement analysis essay, which is due on Sunday. So I've received a couple of outlines or drafts. Keep them coming. Those are great. They're optional, right? You don't have to send me an outline or draft if you feel confident, but it's a great way for you to get some feedback, see if you're on the right track as you're working toward that final draft. We also spent some time on Monday starting to talk about how social movements and social change uses recruitment to get outside groups in and to get people thinking about that process, right? So recruitment strategies, last class, we're really getting into how we use things such as framing and considering the values of audiences in social change, right? We talked about both animal liberation as well as anti-nuclear protests, and about how each of these used frames or ways of thinking about the world that were able to meet the needs and interests of potential recruits. Specifically, how a lot of these movements were able to find people who had similar ideas or perspectives, such as anti-nuclear protesters engaging more with pacifist or non-violence-oriented groups, and of course, a spillover between anti-nuclear and animal rights activism as well. So I think a useful thing to think about in our broader discussion about social change is how do we bring people in? And I think we had a pretty robust discussion last class about how online, right, there's new opportunities to reach a whole bunch of new people who might meet your needs, but also challenges in navigating the sheer amount of content, people, and noise that happen online, as well as challenges with considering ways of bringing people together, either digitally or face-to-face. So does anybody have any remaining or lingering questions about that essay at this point? If you're sending me an outline or a draft, do try to get that to me by Friday so that I can turn that around. Okay, great. Once this week passes and we have that, We'll be shifting gears and talking about the creative movement presentation. I've also heard back from Oregon Rural Action, and we will either be doing something in November or maybe doing something that impacts our schedule for the final presentation days in December. So I'm gonna touch base with them about that. Basically, they're able to meet with us in November, but they have limited people that they could bring, and so it would be a bit smaller. But they could do a lot more in December. But December is also the week where we have the final presentations. So I'm seeing if we can either like compress the presentations to one of those 2 days, or somehow change the schedule for those. So I'll let you know an update on that next week. All right. So for today, I really like this reading. I think it adds a lot to our discussion about social change. It lets us think about a lot of the strategies that people have used on the ground to communicate about social change. And I think a really ongoing and persistent problem is this question of insider versus outsider approaches, right? When you're communicating for social change, are you very much outside of the system? Are you using protest, activism, disagreement within a very public frame? Or are you working within organizations or groups and trying to achieve change working from within? Or are you doing a combination of the two, right? So that's a very practical concern that a lot of us who might be interested in being involved in nonprofits and advocacy in groups on our own time might start to consider. We'll also be looking at publics and counter-publics, and the Brower piece that we'll be discussing for today specifically looks at HIV/AIDS and HIV/AIDS activism in the 1980s and 1990s. So the landscape of HIV/AIDS is one that you might be familiar with, but its impact and the disproportionality of that impact has definitely been a really major concern and issue. One of the things that I think is interesting is that the landscape of HIV/AIDS has changed drastically due to single medication. People familiar with what that medication is called? PrEP. So PrEP is a preventative medication that people can take that lowers their risk of transmission of HIV, right? And so PrEP has been circulated and used in recent years and has significantly impacted and led to a lot of declines in HIV rates. But of course, there are issues with supply, access, affordability of PrEP, and right, it's not perfect or foolproof either. So I think in thinking about the history and the context of HIV/AIDS, the World Health Authority, when it looks at HIV/AIDS on a global scale, right, it's found that there have been over 84.2 million people infected. The current number of people that are HIV positive or infected is around 40 million, right? And about 40.1 million people worldwide have died of HIV. So as you might know, right, it specifically attacks the immune system, and AIDS is considered to be the condition associated once your immune system is attacked. A lot of medications and supports are designed to slow down the rate in which the immune system is attacked. However, HIV/AIDS is disproportionately impacted members of the LGBTQ+ community, right? In particular, it involves generally people engaged in sexual contact who may both have been assigned male, right? So obviously it exists well outside that. There are a lot of members of bi, pan, and other communities who experience HIV as well. But I think it's useful to place in context that it has this disproportionate impact and experience with many members of the queer community. In addition to PrEP, we've also seen a lot of changes in increased medical research and development, a lot of support, right, to help people to reduce the rate of infection, to be aware of what causes infection, and to support people in, again, reducing the rate of infection. So I think it's useful to put this in context, to put in that while the numbers are declining, that this has historically been an incredibly challenging issue with a disproportionate impact, and in many ways sets the scene for a lot of the activism and movement that we'll be looking at for today. So this brings us to Broward. I'll tell you a kind of funny story here about this piece. Several years ago, when I was a wee graduate student, I was presenting a paper, and my paper was talking about the disability rights movement and some online disability activism. And I was like talking about this paper, and I was citing Brower, right? I was talking about Dan Brower. And the Q&A comes up, and there's somebody who raises his hand and like asks about it, about something about my like research method or whatever. And I was like, oh yeah, thanks for your question. What's your name? And he says, oh, my name's Dan. Right? So I was like, okay, cool. And then afterwards, my advisor comes up to me and she's like, yeah, that was Dan Brower. That was the guy you cited. He was the one who asked you a question at your presentation. I was like, oh. Wish I knew that. I feel embarrassed and silly now, but so it's cool to meet him. He unfortunately passed away a few months ago, but his research background and expertise is in communication in context of HIV/AIDS and broader LGBT+ issues. He has a really cool article that did not make it into this class, but it's about how he did an interview study with people who were HIV positive. And wore tattoos that indicated that they were HIV positive, and talked with interviewees about this process of what he called self-stigmatization, right, of labeling yourself in that way as a means of creating conversation and dialogue about HIV/AIDS, particularly, right, as it related to sexual interaction. So ACT UP was an organization analyzed for this week's article that utilizes what we can consider to be both insider and outsider strategies. Pictured here on the right is a major demonstration that ACT UP did, where they were essentially lying down, like playing dead. They even had like paper gravestones that they had made to talk about HIV/AIDS in front of the office of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. But ACT UP also went to congressional hearings and spoke within the designated time and constraints of those hearings and targeted specific members of Congress to persuade them in support of legislation designed to increase medical care and research surrounding HIV/AIDS as well. So I think one of the ways that we think about movements and the ways that movements exist on multiple planes is to think about the ways that they use these different strategies to communicate, and thinking about context, genre, so on. So I think this is a really useful piece if you're interested in studying movements that use those combination of tactics, or as you start to pivot and think about your own movement that you might be creating at the end of the term, what ways could you incorporate both of those strategies into it? All right. So here on the right is Larry Kramer. Larry Kramer was a playwright and comedian who was really well known as being a very major proponent of HIV/AIDS research and care. In fact, he is largely credited with helping to form the beginning of ACT UP, right, in New York City, and in many ways highlighting the issues of HIV/AIDS. So I wanted to share a little bit from him in terms of some of his own advocacy and approach in addressing HIV/AIDS more generally.
Hey, we are in the middle of a fucking plague, and you behave like this. Plague! 40 million infected people is a fucking plague, and nobody acts as if it is. Nobody in this hospital. Nobody in this city. Nobody in this world. 40 million people in the hospital. That's not yelling at me because of some stupid thing you didn't even call to ask me about. You don't know what I did.
Right, so very outspoken, very, loud and in your face in his own communication style. But in this context and a lot of other contexts, a lot of his frustration was not only that HIV/AIDS existed, but because he felt that government leaders, right, including candidates for president at the time, such as Bill Clinton, right, were not taking the issue of HIV/AIDS seriously. We're not investing money in care and treatment. And we're not working properly with pharmaceutical companies in order to make sure that medication, treatment, and care was being given in a regular way, right? So early on, he kind of mixed comedy more with his activism, but generally became more pointed over time. So one of the concerns here is that there was a belief that the pharmaceutical companies that were producing medication to help people who are HIV positive were not dedicating enough resources to circulating and producing these medications, and were not directing enough R&D toward additional medication and support, and that the slow rollout combined with a high price was not only an issue from the companies, but also an issue of governmental and federal oversight. So ACT UP, from this context and from the explosion of cases of HIV/AIDS, became known for unruly and very kind of performative models of protest. So for instance, there was the occupation of the FDA building, but they also went into a lot of public places, right? They went into including some religious gatherings, including those from the Catholic Church, right? And became infamous for essentially going in and protesting in a way that in many ways derailed what was otherwise happening. So what was interesting then was that while this was the initial context, the ways that ACT UP shifted in its communication approaches and incorporated elements of congressional hearings are really important to look at too, right? That not only was this larger scale protest happening, but also some of the other ways that this movement was getting involved, which is a big focus for this article in particular. So I wanted to share, before we get into some of the things here about the public sphere, a little bit more about ACT UP and some of the work that it did.
This beautiful day started with trouble in Lower Manhattan. More than 100 people were arrested during a protest. Demonstrators were demanding more money in the war against AIDS.
In the spring of 1987, an upstart activist group started making noise and changes to help people with HIV/AIDS.
Well, ACT UP was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. It was a direct action political activist group that started in March 1987. My name is Sarah Schulman, and I'm the author of Let the Record Show, Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993.
Schulman, a journalist and former ACT UP member, says the group accomplished a lot in a short period of time at the height of the AIDS crisis.
In 6 years, ACT UP achieved incredible victories for people with AIDS. Some of the most outstanding wins were that ACT UP forced pharmaceutical companies and the government to change the way we research medications for AIDS. ACT UP forced the Food and Drug Administration to make experimental drugs available to people who were sick, even if they had not been approved. ACT UP made needle exchange legal in New York City, which meant that people who were using needles for intravenous drug use could exchange them for clean needles so that they could avoid transmitting HIV through blood contact. ACT UP stopped the Catholic Church when they tried to interfere with condom distribution in public schools. ACTA ran a 4-year campaign to make sure that women with AIDS could get benefits and get access to experimental drugs. And really, ACTA transformed how queer people and people with AIDS felt about themselves and how we were represented in the mainstream media.
ACT UP's public protests could make the group difficult to ignore.
So ACT UP is a very bold and daring organization because people were fighting for their lives. So at one point, the Catholic Church in New York City was fighting public schools who wanted to make condoms available to students to save their lives. And ACT UP thought, you know, this is the state of emergency. We can't just sit back and let the church do this. And it could cause people deaths. So they made the very bold move in December 1999, disrupting Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, demanding that the church stop hurting people, not only queer people, but anyone who is trying to protect themselves from HIV.
Shulman says the controversial protest at St. Patrick's marked a shift in the way the LGBTQ community stood up for itself.
It was considered a real changing moment in gay politics and in queer power, because it was really the first time that people with AIDS stood up to such a fixed, large source of power in New York City.
Treatment for HIV/AIDS has improved dramatically since the 90s. But because HIV/AIDS still exists, ACT UP still exists to advocate for healthcare reform and research, as well as for the rights of people with HIV/AIDS. And the early years of ACT UP may serve as a template to other activist groups.
And I think the most important takeaway is to be focused on concrete goals, to educate yourself so that you are the expert, to design the solution that's reasonable, winnable, and doable, to present it to the powers that be, and if they refuse, to do creative, nonviolent, civil disobedience so that you can communicate to the public through the media and pressure institutions to change.
This is Inside Edition.
And then here's a little bit more about some of
Today's
the.
demonstration is the latest of many staged by the militant group ACT UP, which has gained increasing influence on AIDS policy. The atmosphere in the meetings and at the group's headquarters is characterized by enthusiasm and belligerence toward established institutions. Playwright Larry Kramer started ACT UP to accelerate the AIDS drug approval process.
What right does the FDA and then have to tell a dying person what he can do for the process?
Strategy has been enormously successful in getting the Food and Drug Administration to loosen the regulation of new drugs for AIDS.
So I think a lot to unpack here, right, in looking at the context and history of ACT UP, right? We can discuss and certainly talk about the boundaries of protest and whether or not the sort of occupation of Mass, right, was an acceptable component of that protest. Like that's definitely discussion, and one thing that members and activists have also had disagreement about. But a lot of other things I think that this movement does and was emphasized, I think, in those videos, I think is really helpful to consider as well. One of them being, we can get back to Wander Serrano and the idea of intersectional rhetoric, particularly the ways that the visual element was incorporated. For instance, there was somebody who had like headstone, you might have noticed, and it said, I got the placebo, talking about some of the ways that the medical system and pharmaceutical companies in ACT UP size were causing death. Also, some of the specific demands that were made for reform, right? Discussion in the first video about how creating concrete goals can be a major strategy of a movement. And also some of the ways that the movement has shifted, right? And ACT UP has persisted. There was a poster that was held up in a more modern context talking about how PrEP was $7 to make and $1,500 to take, talking about the cost of drug prices and healthcare reform. Also, you saw kind of ACT UP protesters were marching or involved with other movements, including Black Lives Matter, right? And there was, I noticed a shirt as well on one of the activists that said, "You were on Aboriginal land." So, there's a lot of relationships here to thinking about coalitions, to thinking about intersectional rhetoric, to thinking about some of the goals and strategy and methods that are being used. And I think lastly, right, this idea that the particularly survival-oriented strategies that might be more belligerent or might be more confrontational are often happening in contexts where people feel like their lives are on the line and have nothing to lose. And that's a common refrain that we see in a lot of movements in that. And I also think it was interesting to highlight the internal structure, how kind of boisterous and active within the organization members were as well. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that, about the counter-public and the sort of enclave that exists within that as well. So this connects back to our discussion here about the public sphere, right? So we've been talking a little bit about the idea of the public sphere and of deliberation, but I think that this kind of adds a little bit of a twist to the ways that we think about social movements. Give me 1 second here. Laura is trying to join us remotely and just having some issues with connecting. Let me get Laura the link. Okay. So earlier in the class, we talked a little bit about the idea of the public sphere, that ideally there is this world in which people can openly, freely discuss and deliberate the issues. This goes back to the Greeks, right? The idea of dialectic, that if we communicate openly about issues, then eventually the truth will be revealed. And that idea of a public, certainly a neat concept, but I don't know that we've seen it play out in the ways that might have been hoped for, right? One idea that came from Jürgen Habermas was the notion of the public sphere, specifically the bourgeois public sphere. This idea that there is the town square for people to argue and openly talk. However, right, even from its inception, the public sphere was about inclusion, right? The bourgeois was referring to people that had economic and social power, so it wasn't open to everybody. So kind of from the beginning, there were some issues with how this openness of the public sphere is framed. Who is a part of the public? Who's included? What are the main ideas of that public? The idea here is that the public sphere serves as the intermediary between the population and the state, government officials, and leaders that are responsible for enacting change. There's another, I think, layer to this that we see now, which of course would be media, and how media frames, thinks about, and interprets information that impacts how it reaches the state, and also is filtered back to how people think about issues and topics, right? Again, houselessness/homelessness is seen as one of the biggest issues in the state of Oregon, which has framed a lot of the ways that candidates for governor have been talking about. So we can think about the public sphere in that way, but the public sphere is generally referring to a large collection of people who are discussing and engaging with various topics. And then this brings us to this idea of a counter-public, right? So if we have a public, a counter-public is specifically a smaller circle or smaller group that is designed and meant to exist in opposition to a larger public, right? While a public is a dominant group of people that have a variety of norms, structure, education, media, and so on, right? A counter-public is one that is positioned oppositionally. It's its own community with its own set of rules, beliefs, values, and so on, and it's being positioned in a way that's designed to push back against and in many ways change how a dominant public might be thinking about an issue. I think one really important context and way of thinking about this has been the role of stigma. So if we think about HIV/AIDS, right, there is a whole association of stigma that is associated with it and associated with a lot of medical conditions, right? For instance, there's a fear, oh, I don't want to get it from you, right? Even though factually that would not be possible. So a counter public might be pushing back against stigma, might be pushing back against current drug funding, pharmaceutical, and other related policies. So it might be pushing back in its own right in an effort to change that dominant public. But I think the other thing to think about is that a counter public is a community in its own right, right? A counter public is consisting of a group of people with their own set of norms, rules, beliefs, and so on, right? As we saw from some of the headquarters, facilities, and chapters from groups like ACT UP, they create a sense of community camaraderie and engagement with one another. And we've seen the use of counter publics for this purpose a lot. We think about COVID-19 in the context of mutual aid, and a lot of organizations that were working within a counter public to provide support within that group, as well as some of the ways in which advocacy tries to create a sense of community or safety for members of the group. And we've seen this discussed at a state and even a city level as well. So counter public is a useful way of thinking about how there are responses to an effort to change an issue, but also existing independently in its own right. There's another really important idea here that comes from the Brower reading, and that's this notion of oscillation. In other words, ACT UP, right, is oscillating or moving between a counter public enclave, right? So it's moving between this small group over here, right, that might involve a set of interests and goals within that smaller group. And then it's moving over into more public methods of engagement. So something like attending a congressional hearing or congressional session, right? Typically at a congressional hearing, you have members of Congress who call upon members of the community, guests, and so on to speak. And the people that are here at a congressional hearing are generally considered to be policymakers in a state or federally, right? So if you have a guest who is speaking at a congressional hearing, well, they're speaking to decision makers, literally people that have the ability to decide the fate of legislation, right? But they're also speaking with the potential to reach a larger audience. I doubt, unless you're really into it, I don't know. I doubt many of you are like active watchers of C-SPAN. I'm certainly not, right? C-SPAN is a live recording of the activities of the federal government and of Congress in particular, right? And most of the time you get these hearings and so on, and you would think, yeah, it's not very exciting. But oftentimes there are moments and particular parts that can be gained from C-SPAN that go viral. For example, we have a member of Congress who delivers an impassioned speech or occupies the floor, right, or does what they call a filibuster, where they are able to essentially delay and prevent a vote being held because you don't reach 60 votes to receive cloture. So a congressional hearing, yes, it's not the most exciting, right? But it has the potential to go viral and go public on the basis of it being filmed, being recorded, and being available for the public to see. So if you have a policy leader or policymaker who is showing their opposition or support for something, there's a good chance that that is going to gain greater attention. So in this way, ACT UP was moving between some of their more protest-oriented tactics, such as the FDA building, such as the interruption of the St. Patrick's Day Mass, to patiently waiting and being called upon to speak and speaking in Congress. Another common refrain and use of visual here, right, is the use of the triangle and the silence equals death slogan that ACT UP was able to develop. In particular, the protest that ACT UP did at the Food and Drug Administration headquarters helped it to gain a lot of attention and really drew a response from the FDA, in which the FDA was actually a lot more responsive to the needs of the organization and the ability of the organization to speak back to them. What that then meant was that ACT UP started to get involved in these congressional hearings and started to have guests who would show up and speak to policymakers about the issues that they saw with funding, support from pharmaceutical companies, and so on. We also see that there are a number of constraints that impacted how ACT UP was engaging in those congressional hearings too. A few factors. One of them was that in order to attend, right, you had to be requested by a member of Congress, right? You have to be somebody who is able to attend. You have to be on the docket and all of that good stuff. Right? We also can think about the ways that within an organization, people are not always fully in agreement with each other, right? The strategies, the tactics, the efforts somebody makes, that can be something that can create controversy too. So for instance, there were some activists and members of ACT UP who said, why are we going to these? Why are we engaging with the state or the system? One of the arguments that's sometimes made in a very outsider strategy orientation is a fear that working within a system that maybe doesn't work or is broken is legitimizing that system, right? Or is lending validity to a system that isn't working. The response is that an insider strategy can be necessary in order for a movement to achieve the specific goals and aims that it needs. And none of the ACT UP members that were able to attend the hearings were HIV positive themselves, right? They were allies, they were advocates, probably had personal relationships to people who were impacted or had been impacted by HIV, but that was also a sort of constraint on the membership within these groups. So we saw a number of major themes and ideas that came up from ACT UP in terms of its involvement at these congressional hearings, right? One of them was this idea of expertise. So if you bring somebody in to something like a hearing, right, you're bringing in somebody that offers this kind of pathos, this emotional appeal, and ethos, this credibility that somebody does not otherwise have, right? If you think about members of Congress, right, oftentimes you have a lot of talk on them. They might be detached, they might be out of touch, they might be uninterested, they might be concerned with personal gain over the needs of us as people. But the ability of ACT UP members to speak to the ways that their family members and friends were personally impacted by HIV allowed them to bring in that expertise and speak at a kind of personal and human level that might not otherwise have been understood. Another strategy that was used here by ACT UP was the use of dialogue, right? So creating conversation with members of Congress was one major way that ACT UP worked. In fact, in these congressional hearings, what ACT UP did was specifically seek out members of Congress that they could form a working relationship with, that they could talk with, and have that member of Congress essentially put them on the docket, right? So creating specific pressure and targeting of certain members of Congress who had deciding votes or power was another strategy that made working within those hearings work. Another element is this idea of surveillance, right? So Michel Foucault puts forward the idea of the panopticon. The panopticon is this idea that there is kind of like a tower in the center. It's a model of a prison, right? Where there's a tower in the middle and kind of circling around it, right, are the different cells. And the idea is that in the middle of this tower is a guard. And the idea is that the prisoners who are surrounding this panopticon, right, are people who don't know if in that moment they're being watched, but they could be. It would be easier with a visual. right? So it's like this, where you have this tower in the front, you have a guard in the tower, you have the prisoners who are all around it. And it's this idea, right, that even though you might not be looked at currently, you're going to behave because the prison or the guards could be looking at you in that moment, right? It's the same reason that oftentimes we are cognizant about speed limits. It's not because there's going to be a cop there in that moment who's going to pull you over right then and there. It's that you could round a corner and there could be one. So you want to avoid those speed traps and be careful in general, regardless of whether or not somebody's there, right? So the panopticon, this idea of surveillance, is relevant to this group because it's this idea that if members of Congress are on the spot and how they're responding to this request for more care for HIV, AIDS research, treatment, and so on, right? And they respond in an insensitive or disrespectful way, that crap's going to be on tape, right? It's going to be circulated and shared. And so there's a particular caution that members of Congress have that in many ways flips the power dynamic that we might think. If somebody is in a hearing in Congress, you would think, oh, wow, they can't really say much. They don't have much ability to advocate for their needs, but there's a lot of pressure put on Congress to respond. There's also this idea of access to strong publics. Again, because information from these hearings can become part of the headlines and circulate to other settings, right? That groups like ACT UP are able to work within those larger forms of protest. In fact, there was almost this element of ACT UP almost threatening members of Congress to say, like, you can't find a solution here. Well, there's this FPA building that we can go to, right? And then this idea of multi-forum engagement, that members of ACT UP and members of a lot of nonprofits and other organizations, right, can choose to engage with a lot of different organizations, institutions, and structures in an effort to move toward change, that groups are not necessarily constrained to one form. So that gives us some context of some of the communication strategies and goals. We're going to do a group activity that looks at some of these strategies and talks a little bit more about insider and outsider strategies a bit more. But let's take a break and come back to chat more about this at 1:50. So for the break, we were talking a little bit about some of the strategies used by ACTA. And what I want us to do is take some time to look into this a little bit more and do some digging into this Brower piece about some of the ways in which ACTA communicated and were able to work. So what I'd like your groups to look at, first of all, is what were some of the ways that ACT UP communicated with the congressional hearings? And in particular, this reading includes a lot of vignettes and little excerpts from ACT UP members who were involved in these hearings and some of the things that they said. So you might highlight those in particular. Second, I'd like your group to take some time to think about why members of Congress wanted to respond to ACT UP. What compelled them to do so, according to some of the things you noticed from the Brower reading. And then lastly, take some time to think about and maybe discuss in your group what you see as some of the challenges of insider versus outsider strategies, right? Insider as in working within organizations and systems like Congress, and outsider as using protest or other forms of communication outside of those existing institutions. So it looks like we have about 10 people. So let's do 1, 2, 3, and 4. Do 1, 2, and 3, then 1, 2, and 3. Do some smaller groups this time. So take some time to chat. Have maybe one person or more in your group who can pull up the Brower reading and take some time to work through these questions. We'll talk about them together in about 20 minutes or so. About 10 more minutes. We're working through this. I think 5 more minutes. Any group that would like some more time to through any of these? All right. So let's go ahead and talk about these together a bit. And I think there's some really good kind of evidence from within this reading that helps us to think about a lot of these strategies, social change. Weird. Hang on one second. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ways that ACT UP communicated within these congressional hearings. So let's hear from the group here in the middle. What were some of the things that you noticed about how the group communicated?
We kind of talked about how members of the ACT UP of these narratives help the plan thoughts when they testify.
Mhm.
And then they also used threats and demands, and they threatened them on backlash and protest. And then specifically, they also refused to allow the Secretary of Health and Human Services to present the closing address of the 6th International AIDS Conference in 1992.
Right, so narratives as a big piece of testifying, the use of those personal stories, and also the implications, right, as to those needs not being met or considered in the context of Congress were a really powerful tool here. So there were a couple sections of the reading that I wanted to highlight in particular that I think do a good job of going over some of those elements in greater detail. So, right, this idea that we feel it's time for the voice of patients to be given first authority here. We've waited for 8 years, patients have cooperated, and we're increasingly dissatisfied with results. Fortunately, this frustration comes at a time when there do appear to be signs of progress on the horizon. But so far, it's only rhetoric, not the results, and we believe it's Congress's duty to regularly check in and put some accountability into the system. If we fail to do that, I think you're going to see the greatest explosion of community unrest here since the Vietnam War, right? We very much see those elements you're describing, Elena, at play here. This idea of this narrative of progress, like this is the move toward achieving the societal progress and change that we want. That's a common refrain, right? This idea of being on the right side of history. This duty, right, and sense of responsibility for Congress to act. And again, this threat that comes toward the end about this level of unrest that happens if they don't participate is definitely a really big idea that's brought up here. Another thing that I wanted to highlight then is this idea that I think compels many of the activists within ACT UP to engage in Congress, right? So there is a framework called disidentification that comes from Jose Esteban Munoz, and disidentification is a framework of saying that there is a sort of a larger public interpretation or identity, and disidentification is moving away from that and rejecting that common public, oftentimes in favor of a counter public. But one thing that I think is also striking about ACT UP and its communication is that it's making a specific point about the need for state support, right? The disidentification or rejection of working within the state is seen and argued as not a viable strategy, and instead that activists have to be involved or have to engage with needs of working within state agencies to receive funding. In fact, in one of the videos we saw a little bit earlier, right, one of the protesters had a sign that said "cash, not coffins," right? Having funding and support for HIV/AIDS care. So again, speaking to the ways in which this organization is involved in creating and using these narratives. Again, we can think back to the Occupy Homes Minnesota piece about how narratives have this power to identify, to relate, and to find a resonant experience that could be a personally moving one toward potential decision makers in Congress. So this kind of connects to it a little bit, but why did members of Congress want to respond to ACT UP? What was it that kind of compelled or brought about a response? It's here on this side of it.
So like, as we just kind of talked, sorry. As we just kind of talked about the, not necessarily threat, but the backlash that it was bringing in the community, those actions were not taken. Yeah, just because encountering public agents can be used as strategies in implementing execution. It goes back on it created a large amount of publicity that was later on the backlash of the community adoption.
Right. So as we've been talking about, that's a big part, right, of this movement and of this advocacy. is the sort of impact that could occur. But I think as well, in addition to that, if we couple that with the narrative components, right, that I think that there can be something persuasively powerful, right, about somebody sharing a story, sharing a personal experience, and using that to reach an audience that might not be familiar with that experience too. So especially when we think about the targeting of specific members of Congress who might be more sympathetic or supportive to the initiative, there's this combination, right, of carrot and stick in trying to persuade as well. And the kind of broader question for us to think about here about the challenges of insider versus outsider strategies. Again, an insider strategy, we might think back to Cathcart and this idea of a reformist strategy, right, of making revisions work within a system. An outsider strategy, very much working outside of those. So let's hear from the group here on this side. What were some of the things you all pointed out about some of the challenges of these types of strategies? Mhm.
If they give out information to the public, it could be seen as like a traitor, like a trend insider group.
Mhm.
And then for the outsiders, you don't know the accurate information of what's going on, like you don't really know the credibility of everything.
Yeah, so those are definitely some concerns. Are there other concerns or issues that the other groups were able to speak to as well? So I think this does capture a lot of the challenge, right, in thinking about and utilizing these different types of strategies. That is, when you take on an insider strategy, right, there's a concern. Why are you doing this? Why are you working for this group or for this institution? There's a concern that it kind of breaks you down from the inside, right, or destroys the movement's ability to effectively enact change. I think that there's also this concern, right, of a movement being watered down. That we can think of that as well, right? That if we think about a lot of kind of movements and advocacy, for example, breast cancer awareness, or more generally, as it relates to a lot of issues, raising awareness, right? There's critique that those types of movements or initiatives are not actually able to achieve the level of change that they might be hoping for, and instead are more about supporting or funding the organization than the organization's goals and aims, right? So that can be one concern, is this concern about dilution of the goals or demands of a group that are kind of whittled down over time. I like this point here about the idea that we don't necessarily know what's going on among decision makers on a purely outsider strategy, right? Sometimes creating pressure, right, turning up the heat to force action or response can be useful, but an insider strategy does bring about the ability to understand, for instance, a member of Congress, their district, their demographics, who they're trying to appeal to, or their constituents that they need support from in order to be reelected, right? That context is something that you can gain from the inside and perhaps better speak to or better relate to, right? If you're speaking to a member of Congress from Montana, well, there's a good chance that you're going to need to engage on issues affecting farm workers and farm labor in a way that'd be very different than somebody from New York City, right? So thinking about and applying persuasion to context is something that we can gain from building that kind of working relationship. So I think that the sort of takeaway from this is that the strategies that organizations use are really significantly impacted by context, especially when we think about nonprofits, organizations, and advocacy groups who have been around for a while. There's a good chance that they are able to incorporate those different elements in a way that makes sense based on their goals, their needs, and what has been successful for them in the past. There's also what's known as the pitchfork strategy. It's oftentimes used. So the pitchfork approach to advocacy is one that suggests that there's oftentimes a kind of multimodal method of direct action for social change, that advocacy and pursuing social change might happen through a combination of things like media and educational initiatives, through legal initiatives. We can think back to the reading from last week talking about the Attorney General response to trans legislation, right? The usage of direct action, something like a protest, the use of political advocacy that we've been talking about in terms of congressional hearing, and also a more system or administrative method as well. So the usage of something such as working within proposing a piece of legislation or working within an organization or group that might be involved in that process. So I think this approach is a useful framework for helping us to think about the ways in which organizations pursue social change using a variety of approaches that make sense given the context and given the goals, and provides a way of advocating for social change, knowing that one solution might not be able to address the entire array of goals that an organization has. So again, I am going to get you out a little early so that you can take some additional time to work on and prepare for your essay. So we talked today about publics and counterpublics, right? This idea of a larger group, but a counterpublic that pushes back against and communicates against that broader public. ACT UP as a movement that oscillates between those insider and outsider strategies, right? Uses different approaches to communicate, as well as the challenge of insider and outsider strategies, how organizations weigh the costs and benefits of those, and some of the unique benefits that can come from those more direct appeals to particular decision makers. So best of luck as you're working on the essay. Please let me know if you need any help as you're wrapping things up or would like to send me a draft. Next week, we'll look at some internal communication, be looking at activism, including Indigenous protest and social change, and some of the methods of communication there. So please email or pass forward your group's work for today. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Enjoy this snow, sleet stuff we've got, and I'll see you again next Monday.